Another common input type, which you've probably already used before, is a checkbox. A checkbox, just like we have here, allows the user to check more than one box at a time. Here we allow a user to subscribe to offers by newsletter, email, or post. So let's see how we can do this over in the text editor. Just like before, I'm going to add a surrounding div tag and make sure this is still within this form element here. So open up the div tags to make this block level. Then we can add some p tags for the text at the top. And the text is going to be just what we see here of subscribe to future offers by. And then a colon at the end. We can also use a label for this checkbox, so add this first. So just below the P, let's add our label. And just like before, we add the for attribute. And I'm going to call this the newsletter, which we can link to the ID soon. And then add newsletter inside the opening and closing tag. Just after this, we can add our input, like we've seen earlier. This input has the type of checkbox. And then we give it the ID to link to this newsletter just here. Give that a save. And test it inside the browser by going over to our contact page and then refresh. Okay, so there's our text between the p tags just at the top there. We then have the label of newsletter, and you can also see we can click on this checkbox and also unclick. We now have a checkbox which you can click on and off. Now we can add this in 2 more times for the email and post options. So let's do exactly the same. First, we can add a label, and the label for, let's call this the email, the name of email, then the input with a type again of checkbox, the ID of email, and then close this off. And then our third and final one, this is going to be a label for post. Close it off with the text label of post 2 and the final checkbox input. So type of checkbox and an ID of post, and then close it off. Then go over to the browser, and there's our newsletter, email, and post. There are also some more attributes we should add too. At the moment, these 3 checkboxes are next to each other on the page, but unrelated. We can effectively link if we wanted to by giving them all the same name attribute. This is a name attribute which we looked at in the last video, which we added just here. So let's do the same for our input with the type of checkbox. So the name, I'm going to call this subscribe. And I'm just going to copy this and add this in 2 more times. So this name attribute, as we mentioned in the last video, means when we submit this form to the server, these values from the input will also be passed to. With checkboxes, we can't type in a value like we could with the text or email input. So we can add a value attribute in just like this. So add the value, and this can be the newsletter. And this is the data which is passed to the server once it's sent. So the value for the second one of email, and also the value of post. So each time the form is submitted, the server will get the value of newsletter, email, or post, whichever one is clicked on. One of the key things to notice here is you can check as many as you want. We can click on and off of any of these. This is a key difference between checkboxes and radio buttons, which we're going to look at next. If we go over to the finished version, we've already done these 3 checkboxes we see here. But just below this we have how would you like us to respond. You can see these are radio buttons, but we can only click on one at a time. And that's the key difference between radio and checkboxes. So radio inputs are added in a similar way to these checkboxes. I'm going to add a surrounding div. Again, make sure this is still within the form. And then inside here, the p tags at the top for the text of how would you like us to respond. With the question mark at the very end. And then we can go ahead and add our labels. This also has the for attribute, so we can link it. And I'm going to call this one the phone response. Close it off and add the label of phone. Then we'll go ahead and add our input, this time with the type of radio. And also the ID of phone response to match this. So add that in too, and then close this off. Then we just need one more for the email. First of all, the label, and this time it can be email response. And this is to keep it consistent with the phone response above. Close it off and add the label of email. And then input, type of radio, and this ID of email response. Close it off. Okay, good. So I've used phone response and email response here rather than phone or email because we already have email ID on this page, which we've used just above. And remember we said before that IDs should be unique and only used once on the page. So let's give that a save and test inside the browser. Back over to our current project and reload. And there's our 2 radio buttons at the top. But one thing you'll notice is if we click on these, we can see that both of them can be checked at the same time. So this is different behavior to what we expected from what we've seen before on the finished version. We seem to be able to select both of the radio buttons at the same time. This is because, just like checkboxes, we need to also group these together with a name attribute. So let's add the name in each input. So let's call this response. And the second input, name equals response. And now these are linked together. So let's test this by refreshing and trying both of these. And now we can only select one value at a time because these are grouped together. Finally, we can add a value attribute to also send to the server too. The value this time can be phone. And the value for the second one is going to be email. You may also see checkboxes with a value of true and false too. If there are only 2 options, such as a subscribe input, which is a simple yes or no, then a true or false may be a good use case for this. Next, we're going to move on to another important type of input, which is select.